It was the most grotesque funeral in the history of rock and roll. A stolen hearse, 5 gallons of gasoline, a fireball so massive it lit up the Joshua Tree Desert like daylight and made campers half a mile away scream that a plane had crashed. And inside the burning coffin, the body of a 26-year-old man, only 2 days dead, his beautiful young face turning to ash under the desert stars. His name was Graham Parsons. He should have been the biggest country star of his generation. Instead, he was a corpse being burned in the open desert by his own road manager, without a permit, without a funeral, without a family. But the crime in the sand was not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is that the woman who should have been there that night, the woman he had spent his last year on earth singing to, was not allowed anywhere near his body. Not at the fire, not at the funeral, not ever. Her name was Emmylou Harris. She was 26 years old, the exact age he was when he died. And for over 50 years, one question has haunted every recording the two of them ever made together. Were they lovers or weren't they? She has answered that question, on the record, one time. And the answer she gave is stranger than anything the tabloids have ever printed. Because the strangest love affairs are the ones that never happen. And this one may have been the strangest of them all. This is the story of the harmony that country rock was built on. The partnership that turned into a haunting. And what really happened in room 8 of the Joshua Tree Inn on the night everything ended. Because the fire in the desert was not the tragedy. The tragedy happened 4 hours earlier in a bathroom with cold water running and 2 women shaking a man who would not wake up. She would never sing the same again. Most people who tell this story get it exactly backwards. They frame him as the doomed genius and her as the mourner. He was the doomed genius. She was the mourner. But the harmony was not his gift to her. It was the one thing she gave him that his money could never have bought. And it is the reason we still know his name. Remember the name of a man called Phil Kaufman. Remember the phrase Cap Rock. And remember that there is a cemetery in a small parish outside New Orleans that holds a headstone and a small handful of what used to be a body. In about 40 minutes, all 3 of those things are going to matter more than anything else. Ingram Cecil Connor III came into the world on November 5th, 1946, in Winter Haven, Florida. The name would not survive his childhood. The Connor family actually lived in Waycross, Georgia, where his father managed a plant that built the wooden crates used to ship the family's other fortune, oranges. Because on his mother's side, Graham was a Snively, and in Central Florida, in the 1940s, the Sniveleys were not just rich, they were citrus royalty. Grandfather John Snively owned groves the size of small counties. When the family took Sunday drives, they didn't drive past their property. They drove through it, and it kept going. His father was a decorated World War II flying ace. His mother was a beautiful, quiet, deeply anxious woman who liked to drink. And in the family photographs that survive from the mid-50s, they look, on the surface, like exactly what everyone told them they were. The golden generation of a golden dynasty in a golden state. But inside the house, something was rotting. Coondog Connor, that was his father's nickname, a war pilot handle he had carried home from the Pacific, was disappearing into himself. Long, silent months. The war had come back with him, and the drinking wasn't touching it anymore. Avis, his mother, was managing her own quiet undoing at the bottom of a highball glass. On December 23rd, 1958, 2 days before Christmas, Coondog shot himself. Graham was 12. 800 miles away, and a few months later, a little girl named Emmylou was learning that some fathers come home from wars, and some fathers don't come home at all. She was born April 2nd, 1947, in Birmingham, Alabama. Her father, Walter Rutland Harris, everyone called him Bucky, was a career Marine Corps pilot, and in May of 1952, over the mountains of Korea, Bucky was shot down. For 16 months, his family did not know if he was alive. The military listed him as missing in action. The house went quiet, and the way houses go quiet, when the phone might ring at any moment with news that ends everything. Emmylou was 5 years old for most of it. He came home in August of 1953 on the last flight of released prisoners. And here is the thing about a man who has spent 16 months in Chinese prison camps. He doesn't talk about it. Bucky Harris almost never mentioned Korea again for the rest of his life. Not as far as his daughter knew, to anyone. She once said plainly, "I never talked to him about his experiences. He wouldn't ever talk about it." The little girl who watched her father come home from the dead learned something in that silence. She learned that the biggest things, The things that shape a person's entire interior life often live in what people can't say out loud. She would spend the next 60 years singing them anyway. That was the only real gift she ever had. Sadness has always been what her voice knows. Hold both of those children in your head at the same time, because they are going to meet, and when they do, they are going to recognize something in each other that almost nobody else in Nashville or Los Angeles will be able to see. Graham's wound got deeper first. His mother Avis remarried, quickly, to a man named Bob Parsons, who adopted Graham and his little sister and gave them a new last name. Bob was charming. Bob was ambitious. Bob would eventually, and this is a story his family has always disputed, so hold it loosely, allegedly smuggle liquor into Avis's hospital room while she was drying out and start an affair with the family nanny while his wife was dying. Because Avis was dying, fast. Cirrhosis was eating her liver, and the drinking wasn't slowing down. On June 5th, 1965, Graham walked across the stage in a cap and gown to accept his high school diploma. The same day, his mother died in a hospital bed. She was 41 years old. She would have turned 42 3 days later. Stop and think about that for a second. Some people spend their whole lives trying to escape a childhood. Graham spent his trying to escape a graduation day. He was 18 years old, orphaned, richer than most of his classmates would ever be, and completely alone in the way only the very wealthy can be alone. He went to Harvard that fall, studied theology, lasted 1 semester. You can hear all of that in his voice, the money and the loss braided together into something that sounds like a cowboy who read too much philosophy. Country music people had never heard anything like it, and they did not quite know whether to laugh at him or worship him. Emmylou would eventually decide to do both. The talent was there from the beginning, but it took him a while to figure out what to point it at. He had been in high school bands. He had played the folk circuit. In 1967, he made a record called Safe at Home with a group he was calling the International Submarine Band, and something happened on that record that had not quite happened before. He put pedal steel guitar and honky-tonk piano behind rock arrangements, and it did not sound like a novelty. It sounded like the future. Nobody bought it. But the right people heard it. In February of 1968, he joined the Byrds, the biggest folk rock band in America, as a piano player. Within about 6 weeks, he had hijacked the entire direction of the group. He convinced Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman to make a country record. Sweetheart of the Rodeo came out in August of that year. It is now considered one of the founding documents of a genre that did not exist yet. He quit the Byrds a few months later. Officially, it was because he refused to tour apartheid South Africa. His former bandmates have publicly said, in different interviews over the years, that this was a very nice cover story for a man who wanted out anyway. He formed the Flying Burrito Brothers with Hillman, made 2 more essential albums nobody bought, started calling what he was doing cosmic American music, and in the summer of 1971, he moved to the south of France, where a friend of his named Keith Richards was renting a villa on the Mediterranean and recording the album that would become Exile on Main Street. If you want to hear what Graham Parsons sounded like at his freest, listen to Sweet Virginia. Listen to Torn and Frayed. He is not on those songs, officially, but the country is his, and every English rocker who has ever pretended to know anything about American music has been arguing about how much of that record he shaped ever since. Which brings us to December 1971. A folk club in Georgetown called Clyde's. It is pouring rain outside. Only 5 people have shown up to hear the young woman with the guitar and the impossible voice. 2 of those 5 people are strangers to her. One of them is Graham Parsons. The other one is his wife, Gretchen. She is 24 years old. She has a 2-year-old daughter, an ex-husband, 1 failed record on a bankrupt label called Jubilee, and $46 in the bank. She's been playing folk clubs up and down the D.C. corridor to pay the rent on the little house near her parents, where she and Hallie live. She has no idea Graham Parsons is in the audience. She has never heard of Graham Parsons. And when the show is over and a slim, beautiful, obviously rich young man in a nudie suit walks up to her and starts talking about needing a harmony singer for his next record, her first thought, and she has told this story herself many times, was that he was probably trying to sleep with her. But then he opened his mouth to sing. Just a phrase, just a demonstration of what he wanted her to do underneath his lead. And her second thought was, this man is going to change my life. Chris Hillman, the old burrito, had seen her at Clyde's a few weeks earlier and had wanted her for his own band. He had been overruled by his bandmates. Instead of losing her entirely, he called Graham. "Watch this girl. She is the harmony singer you have been looking for." He was right. Almost a year passed before anything actually happened. Then, in the fall of 1972, Emmylou got on a plane to Los Angeles, walked into Wally Heider's Studio 4, and the two of them stood on either side of a single microphone and started singing. The take was almost immediate. The engineers looked up. Nobody in that room had ever heard two voices locked together like that on a first meeting. Rick Gretsch, the English bass player from Blind Faith who was co-producing the record, later described the sound of Graham and Emmylou together in one word. He said it was dangerous. Not beautiful, dangerous. He was right about that too. The record they made together was called GP. It came out in January of 1973 on Reprise Records. Almost nobody heard it. It did not hit the Billboard charts. The label barely promoted it. Country radio did not know what to do with a Harvard dropout in a nudie suit singing love duets with a folkie from Alabama. But every musician in Los Angeles who mattered heard it. You can trace an entire decade of American music straight through GP and the record that came after it. The Eagles heard those harmonies and rebuilt their whole sound around them. Elvis Costello, a British punk kid at the time, would spend the next 40 years covering Graham Parsons songs. They toured that spring with a band they called the Fallen Angels. It was a disaster and a triumph. Graham was drunk and high and sometimes forgot lyrics on stage. Emmylou would cover for him, sliding under his cracked notes with her harmonies, catching the melody and handing it back to him without ever letting the audience see the drop. She has never once, in 50 years, said a bad word about him. For those nights, not one. There is a photograph from that tour. It shows the two of them on stage, sharing a microphone. Their eyes are closed. Their foreheads are almost touching. He is singing to her. She is singing to him. And it looks, to anyone in the audience, like the most obvious love story in the world. But he was going home every night to Gretchen, and she was going home every night to her hotel room, alone. Stay with me and hit subscribe now, because what he does in the studio that summer, on the second record, is going to redefine what harmony singing can do in country music. And the reason he does it is not the reason everyone assumes. What he was writing those last songs for is the piece of this story that almost nobody in 50 years has gotten right. They went back into Wally Heider that summer in 1973 to record what would be called Grievous Angel. Graham was, by every account of the people who were there, the healthiest he had been in years. He had started to believe, cautiously, that he might actually get sober. He and Gretchen had separated. He was writing better than he had ever written, and Emmylou was in the studio with him nearly every day. The record they made in that room is one of the great American albums. It is on almost every serious critic's list of the best country records of all time. It contains Love Hurts, that duet, the one you have heard 100 times, the one that ruined the Everly Brothers version forever. It contains In My Hour of Darkness. It contains Return of the Grievous Angel. She sings on every single track except one. He would never live to hear it played on the radio. Before we get to the desert, here is the question everybody who has ever heard those records eventually asks. Were they sleeping together? The tabloids have said yes for 50 years. Fan books have said yes. Some very lazy biographies have implied yes. Gretchen Parsons, who was still married to Graham at the time of his death, was absolutely convinced the answer was yes, and she spent the rest of her life acting on that conviction, vetoing Emmylou's face on the cover of Grievous Angel, barring her from the New Orleans memorial service. But the two people who would actually know have said, both of them, on the record, that the answer is no. Phil Kaufman, who was with them constantly on the road, put it plainly. It was a relationship consummated by music. It was not, he said, a physical consummation. And if Graham had not been married, he added, something would have happened between them. But he was, and it didn't. Emmylou herself, 40 years later, sat down for an interview with a British music magazine called Mojo. She was in her 60s. She had nothing left to protect. And she paused, and she said something so specific, Serge, it is worth quoting exactly. She said, I know for a fact that at the time of Graham's death, I had acknowledged that I was in love with him. Read that sentence twice. She loved him. She had told herself she loved him. But she also told that interviewer, in the same breath, that nothing physical had happened between them, because he was married, because she had a 2-year-old daughter at home, because they both knew and never said that whatever they were already doing on either side of that microphone was already more than either of their marriages could survive. Some love affairs are electric because they never happen. Theirs was one of those. He should have lived. That is the tragedy of it. Everyone around him in the summer of 1973 thought he was going to make it. He had separated from Gretchen and was talking about getting sober. He had fallen in love, or thought he had, with a young woman named Margaret Fisher, who was, in an almost unbearable coincidence of fate, his high school girlfriend from Winter Haven, Florida. He had bought a house in Joshua Tree, the little desert town 2 hours east of Los Angeles, that he had been obsessed with since he first drove through it in the 60s. He believed the desert had power in it. He believed it could cleanse him. He was thinking about becoming an actual father. He already had a daughter, Polly, from a relationship in his early 20s, and he had never really been a father to her, and that was another wound he had been carrying quietly for years. And the record, Grievous Angel, was ready to be mixed. He had done his part. He had sung his last vocals in September. All that was left was the final assembly. He decided to celebrate. He drove out to Joshua Tree with an assistant named Michael Martin, Michael's girlfriend Dale McElroy, and Margaret Fisher. They checked into the Joshua Tree Inn, a low salmon-colored motel that still stands today. They took 2 rooms, room 1, room 8. For the first 2 days, it was a normal party. Alcohol, barbiturates, the kind of self-medicating a lot of musicians in 1973 called a weekend. Everyone was drinking too much. Nobody was worried. On the 3rd day, Graham sent Michael Martin back to Los Angeles to pick up more marijuana. And while Michael was gone, Graham met a woman. Nobody has ever positively identified her. She was, by every account of the people who were in the room, a stranger. She had morphine, a liquid preparation, the kind you inject, and Graham bought it from her. She injected Margaret Fisher first, in room 1, then she injected Graham. He had been drinking heavily for 2 days. His tolerance was gone. He had, without knowing it, just taken a lethal dose. The last thing he said to the people in the room, before his eyes started to close, was that he felt fine. This is the part where the story slows down, because this is the part everyone gets wrong. And there is a woman named Margaret Fisher who did everything a human being can do, and she still could not save him. It is just after 8 p.m. on September 18, 1973. Graham is on the bed in room 1, unconscious. His breathing is slowing. Margaret, who is starting to come out of her own drug haze, realizes something is very wrong. She shakes him. He doesn't wake up. She calls to Dale, in the other room, and the 2 women start doing the only things people in 1973, in a motel in the desert, could think to do. They walk him. They drag him upright and try to get his legs moving. They put him under a cold shower. Margaret, in a moment of desperate improvisation that some people would later mock, and that was actually, at the time, a real street remedy for opiate overdose, tries to insert ice cubes as a suppository. Anything to shock his system back into consciousness. Nothing works. They move him to room 8, because room 1 has become a scene they do not want the ambulance drivers to see. Someone finally, at some point, calls for help. He is pronounced dead on arrival at High Desert Memorial Hospital at 15 minutes past midnight on September 19, 1973. The cause of death on the record is drug toxicity, morphine and alcohol, not suicide, not intent, an accident, in the most brutal sense of that word. He is 26 years old. Emmylou is on the road. Somebody has to tell her. She hears about it from a member of the band. She has said since that she does not remember much about the days that came after. She had a 2-year-old daughter to take care of. She had shows booked. She kept working because she had no other choice, and because the alternative was a kind of grief she was not prepared to face. There was going to be a funeral. Graham had told his stepfather, at some point, that he wanted to be buried in a family plot near New Orleans. His stepfather, Bob Parsons, had made the arrangements. The body was going to fly, on a commercial cargo flight, from Los Angeles International Airport to Louisiana, in a plain wooden casket. And this is where a man who called himself the Road Mangler decides that a promise made 2 months earlier, at another musician's funeral, matters more than any law in the state of California. Phil Kaufman had promised Graham that if Graham died first, he would take him to Caprock, in Joshua Tree, and burn his body. Graham had promised the same to Phil. Neither of them had expected to collect on that promise anytime soon. Kaufman collected. There is a version of what happened next that has been repeated for 50 years. Poetic, cinematic. The cosmic cremation of a cosmic cowboy in the desert he loved. If you have ever seen a documentary about Graham Parsons, that is the version you have seen. It is not what happened. Kaufman did not, as almost every retelling insists, cremate Graham Parsons. He tried. He and Michael Martin borrowed a hearse from Dale McElroy, drove to LAX, walked into the cargo terminal, said they were from a funeral home, signed a form with fake names, and walked back out with the coffin. Nobody stopped them. It was almost too easy. They drove into Joshua Tree, out to a place called Cap Rock. They dragged the coffin out of the hearse. They poured about 5 gallons of gasoline into it, and they lit it. It went up. Campers half a mile away saw the fireball and thought a plane had crashed, and Kaufman and Martin drove away. But a wooden coffin and 5 gallons of gasoline do not cremate a human body. Real cremation is done at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours in a sealed chamber. What Kaufman did was, technically, a very large campfire. The body was found the next morning, only partially burned. It was recovered. It was flown to New Orleans, exactly as originally planned. And it was buried in the Garden of Memory Cemetery in a small town outside New Orleans called Metairie, pronounced Metairie, in case you ever go looking for it, where it remains to this day, under a modest headstone that most Graham Parsons fans do not know exists. The desert legend of the cosmic cremation is not a legend. It is just not the whole truth. The desert got the ceremony. Louisiana got the body. Kaufman and Martin were arrested. There was no law in California in 1973 against stealing a body, only against stealing the coffin. They were each charged with a misdemeanor. Each of them received a 30-day suspended sentence and a $300 fine. They also had to pay the funeral home $708 in expenses. To raise the money, Kaufman threw a party. He called it, and this is real, Kaufman's Coffin Capper Concert. He is, by every currently available record, still alive as of this recording, 91 years old, living in East Nashville. He has never publicly apologized for what he did, and he has never publicly regretted it. Dying, he once said, was a great career move for Graham. Gretchen Parsons collapsed into the grief that would never really leave her. She barred Emmylou from the New Orleans service. She saw to it that Emmylou's name and face were kept off the cover of Grievous Angel when it was finally released. 4 months later, in January of 1974, the album peaked at number 195 on the Billboard chart. Almost nobody bought it in real time. It is now considered one of the great American records. And Emmylou. Emmylou did the only thing she knew how to do. She got in her car and started driving. She has said since that she spent months on the road, looking for people who had known him, trying to piece together the man she had lost. She wrote a song about that drive and about him. It is called Boulder to Birmingham. It is one of the most heartbreaking songs anybody wrote in the 1970s, and it is the opening of a solo career that would eventually win her 14 Grammy Awards, put her in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and make her, arguably, the most important female country singer of the last 50 years. She has said, in interview after interview, always the same thing. If it had not been for Graham, nobody would have paid any attention to her. She is wrong about that. But it tells you something about who she is, that after 50 years she still believes it. She never stopped singing with him. If you listen to her solo records, especially the early ones, Pieces of the Sky, Elite Hotel, Luxury Liner, his voice is somehow still in there. She recorded harmonies against her own lead vocals in a way that echoes exactly what they had done on Grievous Angel. She was, in a very literal sense, singing with a ghost. She still is. The plant we said at the beginning, Phil Kaufman, Cap Rock, and a headstone outside New Orleans. Here is why they matter more together than any of them do apart. For 50 years, most of the world has believed a version of Graham Parsons that flatters him. The story goes like this. A doomed cosmic genius, incinerated in the desert he loved, in a ritual he asked for, by a man who kept his promise. Rock and roll's most poetic exit. But almost none of that is what actually happened. He was not cremated. His body was partially burned by a friend improvising with gasoline in the dark, and then buried by his family in a suburban Louisiana cemetery. The pact everyone quotes rests entirely on the word of the man who did the burning. The family disputed at the time that Graham had ever really asked for what Kaufman gave him, and the cosmic cremation story took hold in the years afterward, largely because it made better copy than the sadder, smaller truth, which was that a 26-year-old man died by accident in a cheap desert motel and left almost nobody who was capable of doing anything about it the right way. The people who loved him most, his family, his daughter Polly, and Emmylou, have spent decades quietly trying to pull him back from the myth. Polly Parsons has spent her adult life curating his legacy. In 2003, she accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award for him from the Americana Music Association. In 2004, she produced a tribute concert with Keith Richards, Norah Jones, Dwight Yoakam, and Emmylou. The name of the concert was Return to Sin City, and in April of 2026, more than 50 years after his death, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame announced that Graham Parsons would finally be inducted. In the Early Influence category, the ceremony will be held in November of that year at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles. Polly will be there to accept for him. She has already said what she wants to say about the timing. She was 26 years old when her father died. Now it is 2026. It is, she said, his 80th birthday year. She waited 50 years for this. Emmylou has always been the keeper of his sound. Polly has always been the keeper of his blood. Between the two of them, they have almost pulled him out of the desert. The Hall of Fame that Emmylou herself was inducted into 18 years before him now, finally, has him too. Play any Graham Parsons record from 1973 again. Really play it. Now that you know what you are listening to, you are hearing two people who never let themselves love each other the way they wanted to, singing to each other in the only language they were allowed. You are hearing a man who spent his whole short life running from a mother who died on his graduation day. You are hearing a woman who learned as a child that the biggest things live in what people do not say. And you are hearing what it sounds like when two people like that find each other and find a microphone and figure out that if you sing close enough, if you put your foreheads right up against each other and you close your eyes, you can almost say it. He got the myth. She got the archive. He got a partially burned coffin in the desert and a small piece of ground outside New Orleans. She got 14 Grammys and 60 years and counting of a career built on the sound of a man who died at 26. But here is the question worth sitting with, the one they never quite answered, even to themselves. Was it a love story that got interrupted by an accident? Or was the whole point of it that it was never allowed to happen? And that is the reason those harmonies still sound the way they do, half a century later. The coffin burned, the grave is quiet. But the harmony is the one thing that never turned to ash.